Thank you very much for your very kind introduction, uh, which was
Thank
not
you so
needed,
much.
but I felt very pleased that the Department of English in Sharada Muni College has organized such a wonderful webinar. And I'm also grateful to the principal of the college who took a very serious initiative in organizing the webinar lecture series. And we very often meet uh, through different kinds of meetings, and he often expressed his wish for me to give a lecture in the webinar lecture series that he has been planning for quite some months. And I agreed. Uh, Normally, I don't disagree with anyone. So I agreed, and I said that, well, I would try to find some time because there had been many kinds of official administrative commitments, as you can easily understand. And at the same time, uh, there are different lectures that I have to give. I made promises and I have to keep the promises. And when I was asked about the topic, in fact, I kept in mind the students of the college. And I took up an area which the students love to study. And I know that most of our students are very well exposed to the metaphysical poets, especially Donne, Marvel, etc. They study their poems very much. And I also do like reading metaphysical poets. But the question is how to study the metaphysical poets. We all know that metaphysical poets are very innovative. They make sharp departures from the earlier tradition of poetry. But the question is why? Why do they depart from the earlier Elizabethan tradition? And why are they different? Actually, the poetic innovation, the poetic development is very often determined by the age in which it is produced. So naturally, what are the remarkable features which brought about a distinctive change? Because you perhaps all know that the metaphysical poets were not even in their own period very well acclaimed, not universally acknowledged, I must say. There were very sharp criticisms from many different quarters, although there were some people who liked. It was divided response. And after that, we are very well aware of the 18th century response to the metaphysical poets, because the kind of critical tenet which guided the metaphysical poets were not at all compatible with the critical tenets of the 18th century, and therefore came sharp criticism from Dr. Johnson. And later on also, they almost disappeared, went out of memory. In the 19th century, it was in the early 20th century there was a revival. So therefore, the question that comes up is not how good they are, is not how well I love reading them, but why was this? They wrote their poems in the 17th century. For instance, Donne, here is a poet who saw three kings, one queen, two queens. things. He was born during the time of Queen Elizabeth. He saw James I. He saw Charles I. Three representations of monarchy he saw. It was really very interesting to discuss. Because, metaphysicals, initially the word metaphysical was actually used in a pejorative sense. It was not used in praising them. But later on, it came to be very differently observed, analyzed. We'll come back to that. We'll go for that later on. But I would like to, first of all, it's for the students, because the students should ask, whenever they read a text, they should ask, why is it? Why is this? Why are they suddenly writing differently? Actually, a very irrelevant sort of point, but still I would like to mention, because it helps you to create an understanding of how we should approach literature. Now, T.S. Eliot, long back, was discussing a major problem. The problem is that in the history of literature, you will see that there are some major poets and there are some minor poets. So what is it that makes some major poets, and what is it that some are considered to be minor poets? Can you hear me properly, or is there any disturbance? Can you hear me properly?
There is some disturbance, sir.
There is a sound disturbance, sir.
Yes, from my side?
No, not from your side, sir.
Okay. However, so therefore, T.S. Eliot, to go back to that, T.S. Eliot says that there are some major poets and there are some minor poets. Why do we call some poets major poets and some poets as minor poets? যেমন মধুসূদন দত্তকে আমরা বড় কবি বলছি, রবীন্দ্রনাথকে বড় কবি, কিন্তু বিহারীলালকে আমরা অত বড় কবি ধরছি না। মধুসূদনের জন্য যদি 2 পেজ লেখা হয় হিস্ট্রি অফ লিটারেচারে, then we find that there is a paragraph only for Biharilal. Similar is the case in the history of English literature. So he was considering this, and he said that, well, a poet becomes a major poet when he discovers his own individual poetic idiom. Actually, the poet, in order to be a great poet, has to discover his own creative idiom, his own kind of idiom. Just consider the history of poetry. You will find that it's not the history of some people. It is the history of the progress and development of English creative idiom. So history of poetry is the history of idiom, creative idiom. Just consider Milton. He created his own idiom. Consider before him Shakespeare. He discovered his own idiom. Then Milton, then Donne, then Marvell, then Wordsworth. Everywhere you find this triumph of idiom. And if I fail to discover that idiom, I'm not considered as a major poet. So therefore, let us come back. So therefore, the metaphysicals have been very, very responsible for developing a new kind of poetic idiom. But how is it that they suddenly began to think about discovering a new idiom? Why? It's because there have been changes, transformations. And I would, there's not much time back, because actually, usually I would like to, prolong this lecture for 1 month in order to properly complete this. But I will just very briefly touch upon the points. If we try to consider this age, then we should consider the religion, the politics, the philosophy, and its economics. It's in this way that we find the nature of change coming up. That's why when we leave the Elizabethan period, so there are different kinds of this Elizabethan period, from Elizabethan period to the Jacobean period. স্টুডেন্টসরা নিশ্চয়ই জানো যে জ্যাকবিয়ান পিরিয়ডটা কেন, এটা অনেক সময় প্রশ্ন হয়। জ্যাকবিয়ান পিরিয়ড কেন বলা হয়? 1603 থেকে 1625, this particular period is known as Jacobean period. Of course, I know that all the students know, but there may be some who don't know. For them, I tell you that it comes from the name of King James, James the First. And in Latin, James is Jacobus. So from there, it's called Jacobean period. The earlier period was Elizabeth, which ends with 1603, after the death of Queen Elizabeth, with the death of Queen Elizabeth, and it begins with King James I, Jacobean period. Well, I will include such snippets of information for my students, because it is their preparatory time, preparatory phase. So that's why they will have to know everything, clarify everything. Now, I call it this transition rather, from the Elizabethan period to the Jacobean period as a transformation, as a transition from the age of stability to the age of turbulence. So English history or English society has been entering a new phase of development. And in fact, you know, the Elizabethan period is normally marked as a period of splendor, jubilance, excitement. Here in this case, I will refer to George Chapman. You remember Keats's poem, very famous poem? Chapman's, he was praising Chapman's translation of Homer. So that Chapman. This Chapman is famous for some other reasons, but he was a person who gave a very wonderful assessment of the Elizabethan period. He wrote a poem, a very short poem, not very long, some 5-6 pages maybe. It is Ovid's Banquet of Saints. Ovid's Banquet of Saints. Ovid has been celebrating the world of sense, the world of excitement, the world of mental jubilance. Ovid was doing that. And Chapman says that this is the spirit that characterizes Elizabethan period. Frank Kermode, a very old critic, now very dated, but still very contemporary. Frank Kermode wrote an essay called Banquet of Saints. It is a celebration. It is the jubilance. It is the festivity of life. That actually characterizes the Elizabethan period. But after the death of Elizabethan period, we find things have been very rapidly changing. Things have been very rapidly changing. Why? In fact, you know, all of them are interconnected, but first of all, I will just begin with the politics. In fact, you know, after the death of Queen Elizabeth, there was a major change. The major change was was a change from the Tudor dynasty to Stuart dynasty. For the students, from Henry VIII to Queen Elizabeth, it is the Tudor dynasty. And after that begins with James, King James, James I. After him begins the Stuart dynasty. Well, 1603, James VI of Scotland became the King of England, King of Scotland and Ireland. Thus, for the first time, with the reign of King James I, the concept of Great Britain came up. Before that, it was not really Great Britain under one monarch. This is the monarch who is the King of England and King of Scotland and Ireland. So James VI of Scotland emerged as James I, right? But the major change that came up was related with the Stuart Code. For its excess, for its disorderliness, and especially the atmosphere of psychophancy and all that. Let me give one or two examples. I will mention Robert Carr. Yes, C-A-R-R, Robert Carr, C-A-R-R. Robert Carr actually came with King James as his page, personal servant, as his page. And what happened to him? He was a great psychopath. And therefore, he was raised to the position of Viscount of Rochester, Viscount, V-I-S-C-O-U-N-T, Viscount of Rochester in 1611. And after that, he was further raised to the rank of Earl of Rochester in 1613, after 2 years. Now here, I'll tell the students, because there's no question, the way to ask. Well, we very often talk about baron, we say duke, we say earl, we say viscount. What are these? What are these? Actually, let me explain. In English nobility, in English aristocratic nobility, traditionally, there is the convention of peerage, P-W-R-A-G-E, peerage. Peerage refers to the social rank, the social ranking system. The social ranking system of the nobility. Here we have 5 grades, 5টা hierarchy আছে. Number 1 is duke. Number 2 is marquis. Number 3 is earl. Number 4 is viscount, and at the end, baron. Okay. So therefore, we find that Robert Carr first became viscount, just above baron, and then further up, he became Earl of Rochester. And all of them are normally addressed as Lord. That is also a part of convention. So the 5 rankings are there within the peerage. They are Duke, Marquis, Earl, then Viscount, Baron. So here he becomes a Viscount suddenly from the status of a servant. And then again, he was again replaced by another psychopath. His name was George Villiers. George Villiers became very important Duke of Buckingham. And the Queen of James's wife, Queen also was no less. He was very well known for her excessive expenditure and luxury and lavish entertainment. This actually began to tell on the English economy. And they will pay for that gradually. So this actually started the gradual breakdown of the Elizabethan stability. And on its religious side also, we should consider another point. We know that English tradition was always anti-papal. Anti-papal, ছাত্রদের জন্য বলছি, ছাত্রীদের জন্য বলছি। Anti-papal, papal কথাটার মানে কি? এই যে papal sovereignty, এই papal ব্যাপারটা কি? ব্যাপারটা কিছুই না, ব্যাপারটা হচ্ছে Roman Catholicism. Papal sovereignty, papal supremacy means the supremacy of Roman Catholicism. Now England from the very beginning was against that. And it started with the reign of Henry VIII. In 1533, they passed in the parliament a law that was called Act in Restraint of Appeals. That was to, curb the influence of the Roman Catholics. Because the English church was Anglican church, you know, Protestant, of course. And another point, we should, students have always, I believe, students have always heard about the Canterbury Tales by Chaucer. I believe you have heard about that, and you have read also perhaps some parts of it. Now this Canterbury was very, very important. Very important because of its correlation with the politics. Politics and religion, in fact, began to go hand in hand. It was earlier there also. It started from Henry VIII, but it became very, very strong during the reign of King James I. Now, let me tell you that Archbishop of Canterbury was a very important position. And the appointment to the position meant great power on hand. And during the reign of King Henry VIII, that is early part of the 16th century, around that time, the Bishop of Canterbury was very, very functional in certain matters. What were the things that they used to do? The Archbishop of Canterbury. I have noted down 4 points that they used to always do. Number 1, they always would look for finding places where papal supremacy is there. That means influence of Roman Catholicism. They would abolish this, number 1. They would abolish Roman Catholicism wherever they find it. Number 2, they would always publicly proclaim the nature of English church, what English church is, and how should the people follow that English church. That they used to do. And number 3, this is very important, encouraging the English language Bible. You know that earlier it was terrible. There were 2, I can remember 2 persons, one was Tyndale and another was Coverdale, Miles Coverdale, William Tyndale. So Tyndale and Coverdale, they translated, they've tried to translate Latin Bible into English, and they had to fly away from the country on pain of death. That was such a situation. So therefore, this is something very new that they wanted to do, encouraging the English language Bible. And this is very, very cruel. They were, the Archbishop of Canterbury organized destruction of hundreds of Catholic monasteries, right? Destroying the lives of hundreds and thousands of friars monks, nuns, and rendered them helpless and destitute. This was going on. And this also went on even during the reign of Edward VI, but Queen Elizabeth actually took up a very moderate view because she believed in believed in the sense of stability and order. So that's why she did not encourage excess and repression. But James I once again took up this program, and particularly it was directed towards the Presbyterian system of Scotland. What is this Presbyterianism? এখন এটা মনে হতে পারে আমি এত সব কথা বলছি কেন, তা আমি একটু ছোট্ট করেই বলবো, আর বেশি বলবো না। ব্যাপারটা হচ্ছে যে Presbyterian system actually is something that used to be followed by the Scottish churches. The Scottish church was a kind of liberal church. That means the governance of the Scottish church was very liberal. It used to be governed by the representative assembly of the elderly. So the elderly will be elected and they will conduct the affairs of the church. This was very liberal. But this was not at all liked by the English monarchy because it does not recognize the monarchy as the supreme. The monarch as the supreme. So that's why they would rather follow the episcopal policy. Episcopal means the church governed by, so the church system actually governed by the bishops. That means there is a hierarchy, and that hierarchy ultimately recognizes the monarch. So that's why James I was, from the very beginning, launched a program of opposing the Church of Scotland. So this was going on in the religious field. Different kinds of, penal laws were taking place. And moreover, another very important thing happened just after King James I came to the throne in 1605. This is called the Gunpowder Plot. This plot actually was aimed at killing the king, regicide, an attempt at regicide, killing the king. And it was perhaps organized by the Catholic Robert Catesby, Catesby, Robert Catesby. It was organized by him. It was a Jesuit group. Jesuit কথাটার মানে কি? যেমন এই প্রেসবিটারিয়ান কথার মানে কি, এপিস্কোপাল মানে কি, জেসুইট কথার মানে কি, এগুলো না বুঝলে তো ইংলিশ সাহিত্য বোঝা যাবে না। So therefore they were the Jesuits. Jesuits means the followers of Jesus, but it was actually a sect of Catholics, right? Jesuits, আমরা যখন জেসুইট কথাটা বলি, the Jesuits actually refer to, I'm sorry, it just means the follower of Jesus, but it's not exactly like that. It's actually a discipline, a sect belonging to the order of Catholicism, right? So the Catholics, Jesuits, they actually organized the Gunpowder Plot against James I. That worsened the situation very, very much. And King James I actually began to take a very tough stand against the Presbyterians of Scotland, as also the Catholics of England, the Jesuits of England. In this way, the religious situation, religio-political situation became very, very tense. And after this actually went on. Fortunately, after him in 1625, he was relieved of this, in 1625, and then came Charles I. Charles I's reign was really troublesome, very, very troublesome. Let me refer to some of that. First of all, the decline in economy. There was a steady decline in economy, in the falling scale of trade fiscal policy. There was the disastrous outbreak of plague, killing thousands of people. Then the continuing price rise, and Charles I's high-handedness. He, in order to lead his own luxurious life, used to take, this is called forced loans. Jor kore dhar kora. He used this power of the king, which is not power exactly, the privilege of the king, and he took forced loans, jor kore dhar niyechilen, to the amount of 260,000 pounds at that time, and without the approval of the parliament. This actually first created a sense of anger and disappointment, anger against and disappointment with the king. Things have been rapidly changing, and his indiscriminate use of powers further annoyed the Commons, House of Commons. And Charles I, in order to curb them, put many of the members within the prisons, members of the House of Commons, very aristocratic, important people were, put into the prison. Moreover, the war with France and Spain, Charles's undertaking of this war was fortuitous. You remember, I refer to a person called, George Villiers, who suddenly became the Duke of Buckingham, very important position. You remember that? That Duke of Buckingham went to this war and was killed in 1628. People were very happy that, well, this sycophant of the king has been killed in the battlefield, but the king was very, very annoyed. And the King Charles I ultimately dissolved the parliament in 1629. And there are some critics nowadays. For instance, I can refer to Pauline Gregg. Pauline Gregg says that, well, despite all this, Charles I had some positive points that we can praise. And she says that he used to check all the papers before signing it. He was very meticulous about the documents. He kept them in proper order. So there were all these, but in order to maintain a luxurious life, his loans, destruction of the economy of the country, again, the ill relationship with Scotland, and finally the arrival of the Scottish army against the king, and finally the dethronement of the king and his death. So all these were happening. John Donne actually was growing up to see all this. The political changes, the religious changes, the gradual decline of economy, all of these have been changing the entire world order. Right? He saw the period of stability and he saw the change and decline. So that's why there had been a very distinctive change. I'm not reading all of this, I'm not saying all of this because it will take a much time. But I will refer to now the new philosophy and the new science. This is very, very important. Actually, this is something which transformed the mental universe of the creative writers of the time. Let me give you some idea regarding this. Now, this 17th century actually marked a short break with the medieval scholasticism. What is this medieval scholasticism? There were some scholastic philosophers like Saint Thomas Aquinas, like Saint Augustine, like Ramus, And their philosophy was very, very much axiomatic. মানে আমার একটা ধারণা আছে, সেই ধারণাটাই ঠিক, আর কোনো ধারণা চলবে না। Axiomatic, absolutist judgment. For instance, let me give you an instance. I say, well, there is only one truth, and that is God. This is absolutist. This is preemptive. This is something that is always taken for granted, right? But তারপরে যদি আমি জিজ্ঞেস করি, if I ask, how can you say that there is God? Is there any proof that there is God? How can you say that? That God is the all-powerful. You are saying that this is absolutist, preemptive kind of judgment. But if I ask, well, show me a proof that there is God, then I will go for further discussion. So that is, the second question is the spirit of inquiry, the rejection of absolutism. This is the difference between medieval scholasticism and later philosophical development after the Renaissance. Right. So therefore, we find that medieval scholastic tradition was associated with the Orthodox Christian tradition and Aristotelianism. But it was a traditional scholastic philosophy. It was preemptive, it was hierarchical, and it always tried to conceal explanation under the garb of revelation, mystery, metaphysics, etc. So there would be no explanation. If I say that God has said this, then accept this. And how can I get the proof? Well, there is proof. Proof through God's mysteries, proof through revelation, proof through metaphysics. You cannot ask. You cannot ask questions. You are not allowed to ask questions in medieval scholastic philosophy. And this actually, in this way, we find that we always come across a new term called new philosophy in the 17th century. Everybody is using that. Even before them, Bacon, the great essayist, he is again and again using the phrase new philosophy. He is again and again using the word new science. So these phrases are coming up, thereby showing a departure from the earlier philosophy, earlier traditional science and all that. So, as I said, the scholastic ideal of truth was axiomatic. Axiom মানে কি, যেটা আমি ধরে নিয়েছি, স্বতঃসিদ্ধ. It is axiomatic, it is absolutist, it is an idealized order, medieval scholastic philosophy. It's all right for them, but it comes to be very, very much challenged in the new century that has been coming up. It is the research la verite, the search for truth. La recherche de la verite, meaning the search for the truth, the search of the truth. Properly translated. So therefore, let us go for Bacon's advancement of learning. Bacon, in his advancement of learning, is challenging the absolutist norms of Aristotle. That's why when you read Aristotle's Poetics, for instance, you find that it is all governed by absolutist ideas. There should be a beginning, a middle, and an end, and you have to go by that. There should be a discovery and, whatever is that. So all of these are there, and that is axiomatic, absolutist. So Aristotle's concept of drama and Aristotle's concept of philosophy is very, very much axiomatic. And Bacon is challenging Aristotelianism, and he stresses the importance of judgment. He uses the phrase oportet edoctum judicare, Oportet, O-P-O-R-T-E-T, oportet, edoctum, E-D-O-C-T-U-M, E-D-O, for the students, E-D-O-C-T-U-M, edoctum judicare. That means to be taught to judge, should be taught to judge. Oportet eductem judicare. Judicare means to judge. So judicare is the principle, to judge. And they, in this way, Bacon is challenging the oportet dissentem credere. Should be taught to believe. That is Aristotle. That is Christian philosophy. So therefore, it is therefore a confrontation between judicare and credere, C-R-E-D-E-R-E. Credere means belief. That's why in the metaphysical poetry, you find so much of judgment and argument. They are not taking anything for granted, right? So therefore, you can see that in this way, for the first time, there is a primary development of empiricist philosophy, which later on comes to be further synthesized by Locke. What is this empiricism? Empiricism means a knowledge. ফিলসফির মূল প্রশ্নটা তোমরা কিন্তু মনে রাখবে একটাই, সেটা হচ্ছে কি সেটা জ্ঞান, knowledge about yourself, knowledge about the world. That is the main target of philosophy, to ascertain appropriate knowledge, right? And how to gather this knowledge? The 17th century says that it should be empiricist. Empiricist meaning through observation and experiment. So that's why in the metaphysical poetry you will find a lot of questioning, a lot of attempts to make sense of what the world means around him, right? We'll come back to that later on when we read the poems, if we can at all today. So therefore, in the earlier tradition, physics and metaphysics were considered to be one. Physics, this term actually has come from the Greek word physis, P-H-U-S-I-S. Physis means nature, prakriti, physis. And metaphysics, beyond that physis, beyond that nature. It cannot really go together. বোঝা যাচ্ছে ন্যাচারাল আর সুপার ন্যাচারালকে যদি একসাথে করা যায়, that cannot be possible. But the earlier tradition has been used to do that. Physis and metaphysis, meaning physics and metaphysics, should be judged together, but it is for the first time that in the 17th century we find that physics is separate and metaphysics is separate. And therefore we find that there is the development of reason and mechanical study. As a result of that, we find Newton writing Principia in 1687. We find optics, Newton's optics, published in 1704. We find Descartes, the famous French philosopher. এটা উচ্চারণকে কিন্তু ডেসকার্টেস করো না, স্টুডেন্টসদের বলছি, D-E-S-C-A-R-T-E-S, Descartes. Descartes একটা বই লিখেছিল, Traite de monde et la lumière, the nature of the light of the world. On light, it is on light. So therefore, light and motion, so therefore we find that a new kind of tradition is gradually developing. So therefore we have seen the religion, we have seen the politics, we have seen the philosophy, very briefly though, because there's not much time. But these were bringing about a new change. These were bringing about a definitive change. And also consider some of the theoretical ideas associated with creativity. Actually, it is from the 17th century that we find the rise of the concept of a polite society, a cultivated society. No longer that jubilant society of the Elizabethan period, but a cultivated, urbanized, polished, polite society. A society which is peopled by people like, well, John Donne, then Marvell, then Milton, then Dryden, and later on in the 18th century, Alexander Pope, and many others, Theobald, etc. So the new philosophy, actually, the impact of the new philosophy was not just confined to dry reasoning and scientific investigations. The spirit of inquiry, actually, that was developing from the new philosophy, the new spirit of inquiry, began to develop a new intellectual climate. And as a result of that, I refer to the Czech scholar Comenius. He was a Czech scholar, Comenius, Comenius. Comenius actually was very, very impressed. He was traveling through England and he was very impressed by the gradual development of a cultivated intellectual society in London. And he also wrote a book called Via Lucis, Through the Way of Light. And Via Lucis, it is in this book that he visualized the concept of a universal college. A college that will gather all forms of knowledge, all forms of intellectual activities, a new kind of society. And this led to the formation of the famous Royal Society of London. Right. This actually led to the formation of the Royal Society of London. And much later, in Calcutta, we also developed the Asiatic Society, right? So it is the universal storehouse of knowledge that was created in England. And the reading public also was changing. So let me be very brief, because lots and lots of things are there, but I believe that I'll not be able to then complete. So therefore, the intellectual circles, a lot of intellectual circles were created during this time. And we have a definitive record. We have a definitive record on the basis of the researches made by the great scholars. We have definitive record that there were huge publications also, even at that time, by the standards of those days, of course. There had been, publications on history, politics, law, philosophy, biography, poetry, drama, etc., on different branches of knowledge. Apart from that, philosophy. Actually, everything was at that time philosophy. Even science was philosophy. Philosophy was at the top of human knowledge. There had been, as I said, there had been also cultural circles, intellectual circles. For instance, there was a circle which was very famous. It was called Tribe of Ben. Tribe of Ben, and it was the main major figure of this was Sir Henry Wotton. Nowadays, we don't know about Henry Wotton, but I had to read Henry Wotton quite a lot of times during my research, long back. He was such such a great and fascinating personality of his own time in the 16th century, early 17th century. And also the Middle Temple Circle, right? And this Middle Temple Circle has been very wonderfully described through the biography of the Earl of Clarendon. Earl of Clarendon actually gave us a very wonderful picture of the Middle Temple. And also there had been another called Great Tew Temple, and they were all places, such circles were places for various philosophical, religious, intellectual debates of the time. It was not just for adda, it was for debate, cultural exchange, intellectual exchange. So this was the essential motto of the new intellectual climate. And there had been some ladies. We have also reference to Lady Moore, Lady Anne Merrick, Frances Wolfstone, then Lady Anne Southwell. All of them actually uh, have been very, very much active in developing their own knowledge through the creation of personal libraries. Some of them had libraries and some of them didn't have. So it is in this way we find that they were actually trying to give primacy to the experimental and the rational. And this was very emphatically stressed by Bacon in his very famous, another famous book, De Augmentis, G-D-E-D, the Augmentis, Augmentis, right? Here, he very definitely rejects the medieval scholastic philosophy related to Christianity. That means he is rejecting St. Paul, which is called Pauline, St. Paul's and St. Augustine's philosophy of religion, right? And the 17th century also uh, began to criticize the Neoplatonic tendency of the poet as a divine seer and all that. Such concepts also began to be rejected in this period. So order, decorum, harmony, appropriateness, all of these began to be very, very important. And well, there were two very distinctive concepts. I will talk about that now. Number one is nature, and number two is weight. Remember, our students, please remember that in the 17th century, there were two very distinctive theoretical tenets related to literature. One was nature, another was weight. And in the 18th century, there had been three: nature, weight, and correctness, which was followed by Alexander Pope, even in the Rep of the Law. So therefore, today, here in this class, I will now first of all talk about nature and weight, because these are all ultimately related to metaphysical points. Otherwise, it is futile, or rather, I would say it's unnecessary then to read metaphysical points. In that case, we can just say that, well, these are very good poems. I like it. That's all. But if we don't know the critical thesis working behind it, then we'll not be able to do justice to our reading of these poems, like the Good Morrow, the Sun Rising, or To His Coy Mistress, etc. Love is only the facade, and there is this theoretical, critical layer working within the structure of the poem, right? Well, as I said, that we have to consider the idea of nature and the idea of weight. Well, I can refer to two books. Number one, it's a very old book, but a great scholar, Even now, I believe nobody has been able to surpass him. These are classic books, that's why. His name is Basil Willey, Basil, Basil Willey, Willey. Here is a critic who gave his entire lifetime, entire life of scholarship to the doctrine of nature. It's called Doctrine of Nature and Doctrine of Wheat. Right. If you go to the internet, now these books are all available. Free, but you should collect it and read it. Reading it is very difficult because full of thesis, theoretical things, but very good book. One is 16th century background, and its background in nature. 17th century background, 18th century background, 19th century studies. All these books are associated with the study of the doctrine of nature. So, the idea is, what is nature? What do we mean by nature? Well, nature, in order to properly understand the idea of nature, you know, the Greek word is phusis, 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 and nature is ordered. According to them, this nature, the phusis, as envisioned by Aristotle, or later on as envisioned by Horace, nature is order. Now, nature has two levels. The macrocosmic level. At the macrocosmic level, the idea of order, symmetry, harmony, etc., all are there associated with the doctrine of nature. So that's why at the macrocosmic level, nature is found immanent in the movement of the planets, in the cycle of seasons, in the cycle of the day and night, everywhere. Let me give an example. You have read, many of you have read Paradise Lost, Milton. In book 4 of Paradise Lost, Eve is asking a question to Adam. The প্রশ্নটা কি? জিজ্ঞেস করছে এই যে আকাশে এত চাঁদ তারা ইত্যাদি, এই যে রোজ দেখছি সকাল হলেই রোদ ওঠে, আবার রাত এসে যায় ইত্যাদি. So this cycle of planets, this movement of the planets, this cycle of seasons, how are they taking place? How are they taking place? Then Adam says that it is God's command, and as a result of that, they are perfectly moving. Everything is perfect. So this nature is perfect. This nature, that's why there is no change in the cycle of seasons. There is no change in the planetary system. There is no change in the day and night. Everything is perfect. So it is this sense of perfection that is immanent in nature at the macrocosmic level. Then what does Adam say in conclusion? He says, we should be like them. We should be like them. That brings us to the microcosmic level, to our society. So it is the macrocosmic level that gives us the image of perfection, the image of symmetry, the image of order, the image of appropriateness. That should be followed in society. So it is in this way that we find the emergence of the ideal of order. And that is also the demand of the day, because gradually England is being engulfed by threats of disorder and disturbance, which will ultimately lead up to the death of King Charles I. Right. So it is in this way we find, I gave you a brief idea about the doctrine of nature. So it is perfection and order. So that's why gradually we find that that sense of order, that sense of development has been put forward in the creative writings of that period. And after this also, in fact, I should also refer to the different kinds of, actually, there are different kinds of traditions also that have been helping the French critical tradition and all that. They have been also, upholding this principle of nature. I'm not going into all those details. But at the same time, the doctrine of wheat, actually, it is the emergence of the new philosophy and the new science that gave an emphasis on scientific reason. And I have already referred to the fact that there has been always an emphasis on order, perfection, symmetry. So that's why, Carey wrote an elegiac couplet after the death of John Donne. After the death of John Donne, Carey wrote an elegiac couplet, and where he praised the poet who ruled the monarchy of wheat. So Donne is the monarch of wheat. Right. What is wheat? Very simply said, wheat is objective speech. Wheat is inventive expression, which in Latin is called ingenio. Right. And let me refer to Dryden. Dryden gives us a statement on this. It was written as an epilogue to the conquest of Granada. I think ছেলেমেয়েরা সবাই নিশ্চয়ই শুনেছ কনকোয়েস্ট অফ গ্রানাডা লেখা হয়েছিল 1672 সালে. In this epilogue to the conquest of Granada, he celebrates the age of wheat. এখন হচ্ছে এই wheaterই সময়, যুগ. This is the age of wheat. He says, wheat is now arrived to a more high degree. Our native language, more refined and free. Our ladies and our men now speak more wheat in conversation than those poets writ. You will find that it is the celebration and triumph of wheat everywhere. Read The Way of the World. Read Pope's statements in an essay on criticism. Read here the satires and epistles of Alexander Pope. After all, read the metaphysical poems. The triumph of wheat. We'll come back to this later on. And also Bacon. Bacon much earlier. What does he say in his book, Advancement of Learning, which is published in 1605? He says, if wheat works upon itself as the spider worketh his web. This actually is the conceit that he uses. If wheat works upon itself as the spider worketh his web, মাকড়সা যেমন তার জাল বিস্তার করে, wheat ঠিক একই রকম, then it endless and brings forth indeed cobwebs of learning. This is what we find in metaphysical poetry. It brings in cobwebs of learning, right? Generates more into this. So in this way, we find that the tradition of wit destroys the tradition of rhetorical criticism. Wit also is part of rhetoric, but it's different. The poet, it was very definitely Italian at form, because the Elizabethan theoretical criticism has always been derivative. That's why in the Elizabethan period, their criticism was largely Italianate in character. তার মানে ইটালির যে বিখ্যাত সমস্ত ক্রিটিক্সরা তাদের উপর বেস করে তাদের থিওরিজ। And again in the 17th and 18th century, it was French, based on all the great French critics like Cornell, Racine, Boileau, etc. So Rapin also is there. So all of these, it is in this way that we find that English literary theory is very, very much derivative in nature, at least in 16th and 17th and 18th century. So that's why the Italianate tradition actually brought about the school of rhetorical criticism, and that comes to be gradually replaced by the tradition of the wit. We'll talk about this again further, but we find that this is a kind of very brief introduction to our reading of Donne and Mansfield. I find that that's not much time, but still, I'll just begin John Donne. And in our next class, which is going to happen on 30th at 2, there I will talk about both poets. Now, if we look at Donne, then we find that he suffered much in the hands of the critics. But Dryden, in his own time, says, although he's not very much full of praise, but still he says that he falls below Donne in wit. In witticism, in creative judgment, he falls below John Donne. And later on says, whatever it is, but he has surpassed Donne in poetic achievement. It is in this way that Donne is not recognized. And then also we find Johnson. Johnson actually satirized Donne in a very bad way. But I would not say bad, because actually, a critic always works on the basis of the yardstick that he follows in his own century. So Dr. Johnson was following the yardstick of the 18th century, and therefore, as Donne, a poet of the 17th century, was not at all compatible with his yardstick, he considered him not a poet to recommend. Right. So that's why he says that he reversed the Elizabethan concept into discordia concourse. Actual word is concordia discourse, unity in diversity. And he says that, well, he brought about diversity in unity. Very badly said. So Dr. Johnson said that he introduced discordia concourse. And he criticized, we all know, John Donne's sense of violence, in yoking together heterogeneous ideas multiple sorts of ideas, all put together. Right. But there is a critic, I'll refer to a critic called Joseph E. Duncan. Joseph Duncan says that in the 19th century onwards, although we say that it is the work of T.S. Eliot, J.C. Grierson, etc., but he says that from 19th century onwards, there is a gradual development in the recognition of metaphysical poetry. He says that. However, 300 years passed after Donne's birth in the 16th century, 1672. I'm sorry, 1572. And after 300 years elapsed after his birth, then Alexander Grossart published an edition of Donne's poetry. This was very surprising. Yes, and then the next authentic edition of John Donne's poetry was published by H.J.C. Grierson in 1912. And it was further theorized by T.S. Eliot in his Essays on Metaphysical Poets in 1920s. So John Donne actually was born in, as we all know, 1572 in a conservative Catholic family. Remember, a Catholic family he was born. He was the first son of a wealthy ironmonger who died in 1576. That means when he was just 4 years, his father died. His mother was Elizabeth Haywood. And Elizabeth Haywood had very great connections. She actually was the daughter, she was the daughter of the famous playwright John Haywood. And his uncle was Jasper Haywood, who was very famous in his own time for the translation of the Latin playwright Seneca. Again, Donne's grandmother was the niece of Sir Thomas More, Utopia famous, Sir Thomas More. But he had so many connections, yes, but the entire life was going to be marred by only one problem: being born in a Catholic family. Being born in a Catholic family was tremendous at that time, terrible at that time. Read the life of Alexander Pope, another, and you will see, you'll find out. Well, you don't have to go further. You just read Dr. Johnson's Life of Pope. You will come to know about that. So that's why we'll see a crisis in John Donne and how he made a compromise. This is very important. He made a compromise, which Alexander Pope did not, but he made a compromise. He was being born a Catholic in Elizabethan England, or in 18th century England, was really terrible. John Carey in 1981 published a book called John Donne, Life, Mind and Art. Here he gives a detailed description of the tribulations of the Catholics. It's a wonderful book. I have read it. If you read this book, you will be benefited. There are several things that used to happen to the Catholics. Number one, a Catholic will be debarred from obtaining university degree. And it came to be further strict in 18th century. Alexander Pope was not even allowed to go into a school, public school. because he was a Catholic. So Catholics will be debarred from obtaining university degree, number one. Again, such Catholics, they were called Catholic recusant, R-E-C-U-S-A-N-T. Recusant monarchy. What is the meaning? The meaning is one who stands against an authority. The Catholics who stand against the authority, they are called Catholic recusants. So the recusants would have to pay a fine of 20 every month. So I'm reading a small quotation from John Kerry's book. John Kerry says, the anti-Catholic legislation also made it high treason for any Jesuit or seminary priest to be within the Queen's dominions. That means they were not allowed. If you were a Jesuit priest, if you were a priest, Catholic priest, then you are not allowed within England. That's why within the Queen's dominions, you are not allowed. And felony for any lay person to relieve or deceive him. And if you give shelter to any such priest, then it will be regarded as felony. So this is really repressive. And John Donne had experienced this. So he actually saw parts of this torture and incarceration. Now there had been, for the Catholics, there were only two alternatives. Either you flee the country, desh chhede paliye jao, or they would live a life of imprisonment and torture. অথবা জেলখানাতে ভরে দেবে তোমাকে. So Donne's grandfather, as well as his uncle was Eligius Haywood. His grandfather and his uncle fled away from England. But his uncle fled away, of course, but was killed by a violent mob in Switzerland. His other uncle, Jasper Haywood, was first imprisoned and then banished from England. His brother Henry Dunn was imprisoned for giving shelter to a young Catholic priest, William Harrington, and he died in prison. This was his family. And as a result, John Donne was experiencing a psychomachia, a psychological conflict, and he did not know how to get out of this. And there was no chance of getting higher education. So he was normally trained by a private tutor till he was 10. He could not go to school. And then he matriculated from Hart Hall, Oxford at the age of 12. Why so early? They used to take admission very early and pass out. Why? Because there was a rule, this has been pointed out by a critic called James Winnie. James Winnie says that there is a very definitive reason for this. At the age of 16, if you pass, then the university will make you take the oath of supremacy. So, take the oath of supremacy. So, this was, he did not want to be part of this. He did not want to take this oath, religious oath. That means that was a kind of Anglican oath. He would not accept that. So that's why, in fact, he was actually in a problem. And it has been sometimes pointed out by his biographers that perhaps he went to Spain and Italy between 1588 and 1591, but there is no proper record regarding that. But he registered himself at London's Inn as a law student in 1991, and critics have suggested that during this 1991 period, he possibly began writing some of his love poems. So, and these were just manuscripts, and he used to pass it on to his friends and acquaintances. But John Donne was a very avid reader. His biographers actually say that he was interested in divinity, natural philosophy, politics, history, science, and poetry. Isaac Walton actually was his earliest biographer. He says, he gives us some idea regarding John Donne. He says, his bed was not able to detain him beyond the hour of 4 in the morning. Right? And it was no common business that drew him out of the chamber till past 10, all which time was employed in study, though he took great liberty of it. সব সময় পড়াশুনো, তারপরে তারপরে সেই যুগের হাওয়া অনুযায়ী আনন্দ উপভোগ তিনি করতেন। এইভাবে আমরা দেখলাম এই অংশ। Now after this comes a famous part, the most important part, which is called apostasy. Apostasy. What is this apostasy? Apostasy কথাটার মানে কি? That means you are living, when you live a particular belief or a dogma or an ideal, that's called apostasy. And John Donne's life shows that he could not bear the atrocities inflicted on the Catholics. As a result of his birth as a Catholic, he became the witness of his brother's imprisonment and his consequent death in a jail. He had to leave the university without taking degrees, and he knew that he will not be able to stabilize his future career, and he knew that, like his brother, he will be the next target for torture and oppression. So that's how, perhaps, he decided to leave this Catholicism, but it never really left him. He left formally, but there had always been this lurking sense of fear, this threat of perpetual damnation, creating a psychological horror and anxiety in his mind. He later wrote a book called Pseudo-Martyr. Pseudo-Martyr. In this book he says, I was first to blot out certain impressions of the Roman Catholic religion and to wrestle both against the examples and against the reasons. So he himself says that he has been suffering from this great transformation and change occurring in his own life. Right. So there are so many other things. So this is a fatal crisis, the apostasy. And the next is a fatal marriage. So we can see that here is a poet. We know that he is such a wonderful love poet, people say, but he also wrote many holy sonnets. Everywhere we find this tension and anxiety. It's because of this that I have identified these elements, the problem of being born a Catholic. Number two, the problem of, transforming himself through apostasy. And finally, the problem created by his fatal marriage. Perhaps all of these problems made him such a great poet. We'll talk about this in our next class. I know that I have not been able to complete the task assigned to me, but in my next class, I will be able to complete the poems